Good morning, everybody. Uh, I hope you're all safe and well. From what I can see on my screen, a few of you looks like it, and that's good. Now, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, today, following a request that was made to me a couple of weeks ago, if you remember, by one of you, I don't quite remember who. We are going to take a look today at the rise of neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism in Germany. Also because I wanted to take advantage in a way of the temporary lull in the ongoing violence taking place between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But from what I could hear this morning, I had no way of knowing it yesterday or the day before yesterday. And it takes me a little time to prepare my presentation. That the ceasefire that was put in place on Saturday for the second time was already violated. So the fighting continues over there. But anyway, next Monday, we'll be taking up the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, to go back to the rise of neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism, which is its corollary in Germany, which is an issue of concern for most of Europe, and obviously of great concern for the German government, German authorities, for obvious historic reasons. Indeed, according to a EU survey conducted a couple of years ago in 2018 on that issue, the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany is at its highest level in nearly 20 years. With 85% of the German Jews polled characterizing anti-Semitism as a very big or fairly big problem, and 89% of them saying the problem has become worse in the past 5 years. The official statistics seem to bear this trend. The Research and Information Institute on Anti-Semitism in Germany registered more than 880 anti-Semitic incidents in 2019 in Berlin alone, including cases of vandalism, harassment, and physical attacks. At the same time, the Bavarian branch of that institute registered over 140 incidents of that nature in Bavaria, around Munich, in the Munich region last year. And these are only the official statistics of incidents that have been reported. Every day, apparently, there are instances in which people are threatened for being Jewish or for being perceived as such. Even more disturbing is that this significant spike in a number of incidents has occurred despite the fact that Germany has some of the strictest hate speech laws in Europe. In October 2017, Germany adopted a new censorship law called the NetzDG law that requires social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to delete or block any online criminal offenses such as libel, slander, defamation, or incitement within 24 hours of receipt of a user complaint, and provides for penalties in case of non-compliance, penalties to up to $60 million. In fact, this law served as an inspiration for France's recent similar law on that subject. Also, German law enforcement agencies have carried out a number of so-called days against hate postings, specifically cracking down on internet hate speech. And yet all these measures obviously do not seem to have worked, at least not very efficiently, prompting the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, which is the human rights monitoring arm of the Council of Europe, to publish a report that found that Germany was still not doing enough about hate speech, and encouraging the German government to take action in several areas, such as, and I quote, awareness raising, prevention and counter speech, support to victims, self-regulation, the use of regulatory powers, and at a last resort, criminal investigation and punishment. Now, to better understand the evolution of this problem, we should go back to the end of World War II, when Germans, by and large, wanted to focus on the gigantic task of rebuilding and reconstruction, and to forget the Nazi past and the crimes in which, to a greater or lesser extent, the vast majority of them had been involved. That year, 1945, many of them declared was 0 hour, time for a fresh start. Now, as you know, as a result of the Cold War, the country split into the capitalist Federal Republic in the West and the Socialist Democratic Republic in the East. Michel, if you could show map number 1, please. With the two Germanys, the East Germany and West Germany. Thank you, Michel. From 1952 onward, a fortified fence separated them, and in 1961, as you remember, the last remaining links were severed with the building of the Berlin Wall. On either side, rival visions of the new Germany emerged. Konrad Adenauer, the leading politician in West Germany and the first chancellor of that new country, sought to rebuild the country on the basis of Western Christian values, while while Walter Ulbricht, the leading politician in the East, looked to the traditions of the German labor movement formed in the mid-19th century under the inspiration of Karl Marx. The democratic traditions of the United States, and to a lesser extent of France and UK, exerted a powerful influence also on West Germany. Whereas the Russian Revolution, Leninism and Stalinism, and the social and political precedent of the Soviet Union provided the model for the socialist state of East Germany. Yet, despite all these changes in Germany, the post-war efforts to forge a new identity, if you will, could not just leap across the Third Reich as it had never existed. Germans ultimately had to confront what the Hitler regime had done in their name. But the process of doing so was halting and hesitant at first, and also obviously complicated by the country's division during the Cold War. In West Germany, although the victorious Allies moved swiftly to prevent any of the sites associated with Hitler and the Nazi leadership from becoming pilgrimage destinations for those who still adhere to Nazism, there was a limit to what the Allies could accomplish, could achieve in that area in encouraging or forcing the Germans to come to terms with what they had done. Initially, West Germans, who you can see from the map, formed the majority of the German population. West Germany was much larger than East Germany. Initially, they seemed to suffer from a generalized historical and moral amnesia in the post-war years. And on the rare occasions when they spoke about the Nazi dictatorship, it was usually to insist that they had known nothing of its crimes and to complain that they had been unfairly victimized and humiliated by the denazification programs and what they call the victor's justice of the war crimes trials. Also, many expressed anger at the Allies for carpet bombing German towns and resented the expulsion of some 11 million ethnic Germans by the post-war governments of Hungary, Poland, Romania, and other Eastern European countries. That being said, you have to understand that the Jewish life in West Germany was never fully extinguished. With the permanent settling there of some 20,000 Jews displaced from Eastern Europe, who joined the roughly 15,000 German Jews who still remained in the country after the war, and who were encouraged by the willingness of the new government in Germany, of the new political class in West Germany, to reject in speeches and in the law the rabid anti-Semitism that had been foundational in the establishment of the Third Reich. This tendency was particularly pronounced in the 1960s, during which the much heralded economic miracle transformed West Germany into a prosperous and flourishing society. During that period, West Germans reconciled themselves to democratic institutions because these institutions were delivering economic success, unlike the 1920s and the 1930s. A new generation of young Germans, born during or after the war, and brought up in a democratic society, the Democratic Society of West Germany, began to demand the truth about the Nazi era from their parents and teachers. Historians began to research the Nazi period seriously and critically, as the documents seized by the Allies for the Nuremberg prosecutions were returned to German archives. The West German authorities themselves launched numerous prosecutions for war crimes, culminating in the trials of Auschwitz camp personnel in 1963, between 1963 and 1965. The German student rebellion of 1968 and the coming to power of a social democratic government in West Germany, led by socialist Chancellor Willy Brandt, who had spent the Nazi years in exile, further opened the way to a more honest confrontation with the Nazi past. And even though a neo-Nazi party, the National Democratic Party, emerged in 1964 to challenge those developments and even managed to win a few seats in state parliaments, that party failed to reach the 5% of the vote necessary to secure representation in the national legislature. Meanwhile, in the East, in East Germany, the country's Stalinist leaders wanted the public to identify with the memory of the communist resistance to Nazis, which had been real enough, but which the authorities massively exaggerated. As a result, East Germans were not really forced to face up to their involvement in the crimes of Nazism at all. Now, following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany in 1989 and 1990, two things happened. First, Germans had to find a new source of national identity beyond the liberal democratic value on one side or communist visions on the other side that had shaped the respective political culture on either side of the Berlin Wall up to then. And second, a new generational shift occurred as the senior members of the German professions, medicine, law, education, and so on, who had started their career during the Nazi period, reached retirement age and relinquished power to younger colleagues who had not been implicated in the crimes of the Third Reich. As a result, the 1990s saw a far-reaching reckoning with the past, as new research exposed the roles, for instance, of doctors in the killing of mental patients, of civil servants in planning the extermination of the Jews, of Slavic peoples, of the Roma and other regarded by the Nazis as inferior or dispendable, of judges and lawyers in the condemnation and execution of political offenders, of social deviants, what the Third Reich called deviants, gay men and women, and many others who were victims of discriminatory Nazi laws. Throughout that whole period, Germany's so-called culture of remembrance, illustrated by the restoration of synagogues and buildings of memorials to the victims of the Holocaust, the most famous one being the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, which is a funereal site near the Brandenburg Gate, inaugurated in 2005 in Berlin. All this German culture of remembrance, as it was called, had received wide recognition. Not surprisingly, this period of national reckoning extended to the contemporary German political culture as well. Indeed, no European country has been more pacifist in sentiment or more opposed to military intervention outside its own borders. No European country has placed more weight on stability and continuity, and none has been more welcoming to immigrants and refugees, including Greek, Italian, Spanish, and Turkish, what Germany called guest workers, drawn at that time by the German economic boom. And yet, and this is remarkable, this policy of large inclusion in general did not necessarily reflect an immediate conversion in long-standing anti-Semitism attitude on the ground. On the contrary, I would say, a desire among many Germans to deflect or repress guilt for the Holocaust led to a new form of antipathy towards Jews, a phenomenon that came to be known as secondary anti-Semitism, in which Germans resent Jews for reminding them of their guilt, reversing the victim and perpetrator roles. According to an Anti-Defamation League survey conducted about a few years ago, 51% of Germans at the time said that, and I quote, Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. And 30% of the Germans polled agreed with the statement, people hate Jews because of the way Jews behave. Two major factors seem to have led to the rise of anti-Semitism in recent years in Germany. As you know, in 2015, Germany began taking in many asylum seekers and migrants from Middle Eastern countries where anti-Jewish sentiments and hate against Israel are openly expressed. For instance, another Anti-Defamation League survey a couple of years ago found that 56% of Muslims in Germany harbored anti-Semitic attitude, compared with 16% for the overall population. Also, conservative Jews see the German political left as unwilling to name this problem out of reluctance to further marginalize an already marginalized group, the Muslims, and because of leftist anti-Zionism positions. It should be noted that this alleged approach of the German political left towards Muslim anti-Semitism is also denounced by a number of Israeli political leaders, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has strongly criticized the several thousand of young Israelis for having moved in recent years to Germany in search of what Netanyahu put in the easy diasporic life over the building up of a strong Jewish state. Now, these young Israeli professionals themselves are left-leaning in general, and had given, and that's ironic in a way, they have given as prime reason for leaving Israel the increasingly anti-Palestinian policy conducted by Netanyahu's government. In other words, these people left Israel because of the strict, what they consider to be a discriminatory policy of their government towards Palestinians, to be welcomed, if I may say, by the same Palestinians in Germany who showed anti-Semitic tendencies. Furthermore, many Muslims criticize the notion of Muslim anti-Semitism as strongly suggesting that hatred of Jews is intrinsic to their faith, arguing that European anti-Semitism was exported to the Middle East in the 19th century and was only, if I may say, Islamized, starting in the late 1930s, a process later catalyzed by the Arab-Israeli conflict. That being said, many German Jews see the greatest peril of anti-Semitism as coming from the emboldened German extreme right that is hostile to both Muslims and Jews, pointing out that anti-Jewish chants in Berlin, on Berlin streets, had been taking place even before the 2015 refugee arrivals. Now, two major right-wing organizations in particular have drawn attention for their anti-immigrant and occasionally anti-Semitic positions of their members. The first one, the older one, is called Pegida, which is Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West, which was formed in 2014 in Dresden, which is not a coincidence. Dresden happens to be in East Germany, and has since held a series of mass street demonstrations against immigration in general, calling for the preservation of German culture and decrying religious fanaticism. Opinion surveys showed at that time that although somewhere between a third and half of all Germans sympathize with the movement's complaints, the great majority declared themselves unwilling to join in the demonstration, considering Pegida's fears of a supposed overwhelming of German and European culture by Muslim immigrants to be grossly exaggerated. Now, That Pegida then was replaced 3 years later or 4 years later by another political movement, Alternative for Germany, or AFD in German, which has emerged as a conventional political party that has clearly today the preference of German anti-Semites. A 2018 survey found that 55% of AFD supporters believe that Jews have too much influence on the world, far more than the 22% average for the overall population. The AFD does not, however, agitate directly against Jews like the far-right parties of old. Its politicians practice more insidious forms of secondary anti-Semitism. For instance, in a 2017 speech in Dresden, Björn Höcke, who is the head of the AFD of that party, in the Eastern German state of Thuringia, lamented the existence of the Holocaust Memorial near the Brandenburg Gate, the one that I mentioned to you, referring to it as a monument of shame and calling for a 180-degree turn in Germany's politics of memory. To deny the Holocaust in Germany is illegal, but to suggest that it be forgotten is another way of reaching the same end. And yet, AfD is today the third largest political party in Germany, having gained some 94 out of 598 seats in the Bundestag, which is a German parliament, in the last elections. Interestingly enough, again, the AfD enjoys its strongest support in the former East Germany, with more than 20% of voters in the 5 states there, casting their ballots for the party at these last elections, in contrast to between 7 and 12% in the former West German states. This again, as I mentioned earlier, reflects the failure of the former communist regime to instill an adequate culture of remembrance in its citizens. And as a result, former East Germans don't seem to have the same allergy to right-wing extremists that former West Germans have in the past few years. Now, more worrisome, however, is the fact that these parties represent an overt expression of an undercurrent of racism and anti-Semitism that had spread across Germany and indeed across the rest of Europe, as you can see from the developments there. Often intertwined with economic and social resentments, demonization of Jews has long been part of Christian tradition, obviously, and with the recent rise of European nationalism, it has been exacerbated. It has fueled a rebellion against the liberal democratic order, including the place of the some 220,000 Jews living today in Germany among 82 million Germans. That in turn has encouraged many neo-Nazis and right-wing sympathizers who had kept themselves under the radar up to now to express their view openly, spreading hate speech, through the social media in all of Europe and connecting with others who share their ideology, according to which Germans are brainwashed and controlled somehow by so-called dark forces backed and financed by Jewish personalities or families such as George Soros or the Rothschilds, and ideologies such as Zionism. Not long ago, such developments would have sparked an emotional political debate in Germany. But something fundamental seems to have changed. And the fact of conservative politicians showing open sympathy for right-wing positions is just part of it. More troubling is a structural attack on the very notion of a rational discourse governed by rules held in common in the German society. Among them, that the press is a respected fourth pillar of democracy rather than a provider of fake news, term used in Germany also by the right-wing politician to discredit the work of journalists covering the most controversial subjects, including neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism, and that there is room for disagreement, but not for obvious lies and falsehoods. The stakes today are particularly high because a violent right wing is rising in a country still troubled by its racist and murderous past. In that context, Germany's renewed confrontation with neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism will say much, not just about the fate of an unnerved Jewish community, but also about the endurance of any nation's capacity to build a tolerant, pluralistic society resistant to the temptation of ethno-nationalism. So this is, in a nutshell, if you will, the reasons for the rise of populism and everything that comes with him, neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism today in Germany. I like to add the fact that if you can remove the map, please, Michelle, thank you. I want to add that this is not specific to Germany. Again, as I said earlier, you might have seen that in other European countries as well, and not European countries. But obviously, Germany is a particularly sensitive case, since, well, for obvious reasons. So now I am opening the floor to your questions. And again, as I mentioned just before we started, considering the topics today and what's going on here and there, you're welcome to ask me to discuss other subject than the one that we just looked
Pierre,
at.
did you want to show the other map, or did I miss that?
I didn't say anything about the other. There was no need.
Okay. I thought maybe I missed you.
No, you didn't.
Okay.
You couldn't do that. No. All right. So, okay, Sherry. So that was at your request. Very well. I hope you're satisfied.
Yeah, thank you very much for doing that. Yeah, I guess, the reason I had I had indicated the request was because, to me, Germany is a bellwether of what is happening elsewhere.
Is it, yeah, I'm going to ask you out of curiosity, just for me and for the rest of us, why did you come up with this particular subject at this time?
Okay, well, one of the things is, I study genocide. That's my area of study. And so I follow what happens, what's happening today in different parts of the world and the rise of anti-Semitism.
Unfortunately, Sherry, the connection is not very good. I cannot hear you I hear you, then you break up and you come back.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I can't do anything about that.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Maybe you can type it.
Okay, I'll type in chat.
Okay. All right. So the discussion is open to, anything that you'd like to discuss today over the past couple of weeks, actually, because now I remember we didn't meet last week. And again, next week we'll look at Azerbaijan and Armenia, which, for a number of reasons, I believe the fighting will go further than up to now for a number of reasons. I don't know if Putin is going to put his foot down, or he's going to be in a position actually Russia will be strong enough to impose a ceasefire over there. But obviously, Russia needs some peace and quiet on its border, considering what's happening in this neighborhood, in Ukraine, in Belarus, which we might take a look at also. Obviously, we have the American elections coming up soon, but we'll try to also to include one or two other issues to look at Belarus maybe one Monday. And with what is happening in Kyrgyzstan, for instance. So these are areas Putin doesn't need another sensitive, another war on his borders between two of his former republics. Mark, Portugal has eliminated all drug laws with mixed results. It did? Can you comment? You see, I didn't even know, so I cannot comment on it, really. When did that happen? It flew under the radar because I didn't know. This is news to me, and thank you for letting me know. But I didn't know. So I had a hard time commenting on it, whether the results were mixed or successful, or I don't know. And I don't even know why they eliminated the drug. You said all drug laws. You mean hard drugs and marijuana and everything else? With mixed results. Curious with the turmoil in the US.
Yeah, Pierre?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I heard on NPR today that I think about several years ago that Portugal had decriminalized heroin and all kinds of hard drugs. And they were fearful of doing it. They did it because they could not control it. It wasn't working, trying to put people in jail or penalize it. Yet they were fearful that it would be a magnet for other countries or people to go there. And I think there were mixed results, and I hadn't heard anything about this. And I wanted to do some research, but you're right, it did seem to fly under the radar here.
I haven't heard anything about it. Even, I mean, even looking at the European press, I have not. It flew under the radar. Maybe in Europe at the time. Do you know when that was? A few years ago, you said?
I believe a few years ago, yeah.
I'm going to look it up, but I had no idea.
Well, how about, like, I'm guessing maybe like Amsterdam, the Netherlands, where they have very liberal criminalization of drugs.
Yes, but I don't know. I don't know if they do that on hard drugs. I think that they've done it on
marijuana.
On marijuana, yes.
What about Switzerland?
Sorry?
Switzerland. I believe they decriminalized heroin.
I think that in Switzerland, they might have what they call a votation soon for something which is not related at all to drugs. But as you know, in Switzerland, since the population is relatively small, they can afford the luxury of having referendums on everything. So it seems to me, I'm not quite sure, but it seems to me that Switzerland put that question to the voters in an upcoming referendum, which might have had, or they voted on it not long ago. I'm going to look it up and try to give you an answer by next Monday. It seems to me that they put this the drug issue on the referendum about migrants, to admit more migrants in Switzerland, which was turned down by a majority, not a very large majority, but by a majority of Swiss. But I don't know what happened to the referendum on drugs. I'm going to look it up. I know that France planned on allowing, again, eliminating some drug laws, but again, not as regard the heroin and cocaine. I think though the hard drugs are still prohibited. So I'm going to look it up for next Monday, Mark.
All right, thank you.
What you wrote something else. You started the sentence. Curious with the turmoil in the U.S. that for heroin.
No. Yeah, I meant I got connected. I was curious with the turmoil in the United States going on now. Why has there haven't been, I don't know, international conflicts or the United States being tested in some way, or provoked by whether North Korea or, because the United States is kind of vulnerable now. And often when they think a government is a little shaky or whatever, they probe, or outside forces try to promulgate some kind of conflict. And it's been remarkably quiet on a large scale. The United States with, international affairs is very low key. And you think that there might be some increase in that.
I would take the opposite position. I would say, rather than the foes or people who do not want Trump re-elected, have every interest to stay put for the time being and not to start any type of incidents that might give this administration a pretext to reunite Americans, and give more power to the president, or not more power, but more authority, moral authority to the president over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Because obviously, if you start an incident somewhere, whether it's China in the South China Sea or in Hong Kong or North Korea, like you mentioned, you might run into the danger of strengthening the position of the commander-in-chief in the United States. And reuniting a sort of, well, not necessarily reuniting, but the opposition, the democratic opposition, would have a very hard time criticizing the president during a conflict, okay? During an
That might Trump surreptitiously start something to try to do that, to try to consolidate American support by picking some artificial situation to make it look as if they're threatening America and trying to deflect the attacks by the Democrats?
No, it seems to me that now, if you're referring to this present situation, now everybody's waiting for a couple of weeks to see how things are going to turn out. And the polls now, whether can be trusted or not, seem to show the Democrats in the lead. So I guess China particularly, which would like to see a new administration in Washington in January, has no interest whatsoever in starting anything right now, which might backfire. So for the time being, there might be a backlash even more against China. Do not forget that China doesn't, I mean, there is not much sympathy for China in the Democratic Party either. This is China is one of the very few issues where you have a bipartisan position of trying to stand up to China. Even though the Democrats obviously will not say it, but if you listen to Biden and what he said up to now, he doesn't have, his policy towards China would be very similar to Trump's. So I don't think China would start anything before the elections. Alan, you mentioned that Soros has played a role in fighting anti-Semitism in Germantown. Can you comment on what sort of activity Soros is involved in Europe? Well, Soros in Germany has mostly financed NGOs, which are trying to spread democratic values and pro-immigrant feelings in the German civil society. Obviously, in Hungary, which is his country of origin, he was much more active with a university that he opened there, which was a sore point in the Prime Minister Orban's eyes. So Orban passed a law in Hungary which prevented Soros from financing the activities of his university, and all but making it impossible for him to continue in Budapest. So most of the activities in Hungary, he moved them to Vienna, Austria. He kept a small office in Hungary. Again, in Hungary, it was a university, so obviously, again, preaching, if you will, democratic values and criticizing the Orban's government for its illiberal tendencies. So his activities for a small country like Hungary, he was extremely active there. He still kept an office, it seems to me, in Budapest, but most of his activities now and the university site per se was moved to Vienna. But again, for Germany, and again, Soros comes up in every country because he's been financing these liberal NGOs in most countries in Europe and the United States. So his name will come up every time you have a right-wing organization or a movement. He's designated as one of the number one enemies, if I may say so. Doris, drug laws was decriminalized in 2001. You mean in Portugal? Okay, so that's been a long time. I didn't know then, and I didn't know today, but it's been 20 years, and in other words, so I don't know how much success Portugal achieved, and I don't know if there is a rush from other European UN member states to Portugal to buy organized crime from other countries to come to Portugal and for supplies. I have no idea. From Sherry, the rise of the neo-Nazi movement is particularly disturbing given how strongly West Germany has reckoned with the past. It's indicative of the difficulties in managing all hatreds, which merely get deep-fixed rather than eradicated. The influence of AFG in the former East Germany and spreading to the western part of the country illustrates this. It does not bode well for Jews anywhere, especially given the rise of anti-Semitism in other Western nations, including the United States. I was interested in your take on what is happening in Germany, and you confirmed everything I've been hearing. Thank you for sharing. Well, you're welcome. Yes, it goes to show, you're absolutely right, Sherry. It goes to show that basically it's almost impossible to legislate, okay, this type of feelings because they are passed on from generation to generation, if I may say. So no matter how much teaching is done in school, there will always be, as I always believed, translated to this country, I do not believe that racism per se can be legislated. I do believe that discrimination can be legislated and different acts of discrimination can be, which is the expression of racism and anti-Semitism. But I do not believe that racism per se can be eradicated because it's in the nature, it's passed on and it's something that goes back centuries and centuries. And fighting it, it should be fought, obviously, but eradicated, that's much too ambitious a goal, I think, and it will never be completely achieved and carried out. And obviously, Germany is a case in point. Germany, it's something that, again, only 70, we go back in time, only 70 years, it's nothing in a larger scheme of things. And what happened 70 years ago could very well, for whatever reason, be reproduced somewhere, whether in Germany or somewhere else. again, I personally, I can see such a scenario. The only difference today, and I go back to anti-Semitism, is that unlike 1940 and 1940 and the 30s and 40s, there is a country called Israel. So that, to some extent, is a sort of insurance that things would not happen the same way. But anti-Semitism in Western Europe or the United States or in other parts of the world, and openly and publicly, I can see it happen. From Peggy, do you think Trump's focus on American nationalism and isolationist influence the European movements towards their various countries' own isolation nationalism? I would say to you, Peggy, that everything that the United States does, the United States is still considered as a leading power in the world, particularly in the West, which cannot forget, whether they are trying sometimes very hard, that without the US help and assistance, as they say in France, they would all be speaking German today. And obviously, everything that comes from the United States or is perceived as a trend in the United States, sooner or later, is embraced in Europe. Now, the reason for isolationism or nationalism or populism, I don't think that was imported per se from the United States. I believe that populism and nationalism have started in Europe even before Trump came to power. It started in Western Europe anyway, with the arrival, as you know, in 2015, at the time Obama was president here, and 2015 of 1 million migrants from refugees from the Middle East, particularly Syria and some African countries. And by a certain number of laws that had been put in place by socialist governments in Europe. For instance, a law that was voted by the French Parliament back in the late 70s, early 80s, called for immigrants who were already male immigrants who were already in France legally and sometimes even illegally, to bring in their families from wherever wherever they were, in the name of the family reunion principle. So instead of having one migrant as a guest worker, if you will, with a residency of 2 or 3 or 4 years limited, who eventually would go back to his country, whether his country was, I don't know, Algeria, Morocco. These are, North Africa is a bad example because most of the people who came from those countries came in the 50s, 60s, early 70s, and most of them were they had dual nationality, French and Moroccan, French and Tunisian, French and Algerian. So that was a different situation. But for people coming from the south of Sahara, in the South Sahara, like Mali or Ivory Coast or Senegal or other countries in Africa, and Syria, or more recently, they were allowed, after a number of years of residence in France, for instance, to bring in their families. Very often extended families, cousins, nephews, wives. I say wives because very often, since they were Muslim, they had more than one, with all the children. So that created a situation which was which spread and was not manageable anymore by the French authorities, which all in turn led to a, if you will, a second type of culture in the middle of the French culture, which was totally different from the French one in every way, particularly religiously. So that became a huge issue, as you must have seen from what happened the other day in Paris, near Paris. So that's a huge issue, and in Germany, which was trying to absorb 1 million refugees or 800,000 refugees, and has struggled since 2015 to do so. That's a huge issue also. So just to try and answer your question, Trump's focus on the United States did not help, let it put the other countries, okay? But is not the source, or the main source, of populism and nationalism in Europe. That has started even before Trump takeover, I mean, election back in 2016. The issue of free speech is important to consider while discussing the rising values of AFD spreading all over Europe. Absolutely. What is free speech? Where free speech has really limits to free speech? The freedom of expression, or can it be limitless? Can you say anything on internet, on social media?
I'm thinking specific. I'm Danish, and I'm thinking specifically a few years ago, one of the Danish artists who made drawings in the national paper called Jylland-Posten of pictures of the Prophet Muhammad, which were not very attractive. There was an uproar throughout the Muslim world, all over the world, and it was very, very seriously criticized. And it was talked about and dealt with for a long time. And this artist was threatened with his life, and he had to hide, and so on and so forth. My opinion, it's my opinion, is that free speech is wonderful. I love free speech. We should have free speech, but we should think before we use it, because this artist should have considered what his pictures, what they would have created, what kind of animosity and uprising and feelings they would have created. So I am, still torn, but I think there is a limit sometimes. He should not have done it, and at least not that way. And that to me, I'm very much against all the values of AFD and what goes on all in Europe, and it's rising, and I'm very upset to see it rising in my country too. But still, free speech must not, what is the word, provoke the other side. Do you try to get what I'm saying?
Absolutely, I understand very well what you're saying. That can be the topic of real discussion. Obviously, what is free speech and how far free speech can go? There is one thing on which I might not agree with you, is that provocation, and I admit there was provocation, should not lead to loss of human life, no matter what. There are limits. You can oppose it, you can denounce it, but you cannot physically harm someone who came online with, for whatever reason. That, to me anyway, is unacceptable, no matter how serious the provocation is. That being said, we could have a discussion about what is provocation or not. I like also to point out to you is that Denmark, for all intents and purposes, is a Western country. And in Denmark, like in France, blasphemous, what is considered to be blasphemous in other countries, is accepted in Denmark, culturally, is accepted in Denmark and in France. And those images or drawings were not published in an Arab paper in the Arab countries. They were published in Denmark, in a Danish newspaper for Danish readers and Danish audience, or other European countries, like Le Canard Enchaîné in France, as you know, which republished them with the results that we know. Okay. I can understand that some people living in those countries were upset. But again, to go as far as killing or harming physically the authors, to me, no matter what the how blasphemous the nature of the drawings were, is not acceptable. But
yeah, I agree.
I would be open to a discussion which is a more philosophical discussion than a political. Obviously, it has political ramifications, but I'm open to a philosophical discussion of what free speech is and how far it can go, and if we really have to think about it 50 times before publishing something that might be considered offensive to someone else or to a different culture.
Can you hear me? I think if you limit free speech to what is acceptable in a country, then it's not free speech. I mean, it's either free speech or it isn't.
It's limited free. It's limited.
I don't think you can do that. I mean, that opens a whole can of worms.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why I welcome a discussion. Everybody has his opinion.
And again, sometimes artists will do things that they know is going to provoke a social political backlash. If you recall, was it the Madonna that was displayed in the museum here that Giuliani shut down? I can't remember which it was, a Madonna figure.
Absolutely, it's a different it's a different approach, it's a different culture, and some newspaper like Le Canard Enchaîné, again, which published a number of drawings over the years showing Jesus in different positions and showing and making fun of the Jewish religion or the Buddhist. There were never any incidents over it. And you can argue that those are different culture and religions, confessions, than the Christian one.
And people may not like it. They may disapprove of it, which is
absolutely,
their absolute right.
There is absolutely, as I said earlier, as a journalist also, there is no, in my opinion, and I very seldom give my opinion on these issues, which are really complicated, because I just try to give you information, not to shape this information one way or the other to be as impartial as possible. As a journalist, I strongly believe that doing harm to someone for expressing his views is unacceptable, no matter, again, how offended those people might be.
So
but
you don't think that teachers should...
is a political issue also, because of everything that happened in the world in the past 20 years, starting with 9/11, and then everything that happened. So every government is trying to struggle with this issue, which is a very serious one.
So you don't think that teacher in France should have been beheaded?
Oh my God.
No.
I mean, I hope you know me better, I mean, even though you might not know me, but to even think for a second, no.
That was an awful joke that I just made.
Yeah, it was not an awful joke, but what happened.
I mean, my saying it was awful.
It's absolutely unforgettable. All right. So from Tom, Germany as a whole has at least made a concerted effort to come to terms with its past crimes. Could you compare and contrast how Japan has over the years made little to no effort to acknowledge its crime during World War II and seems to have no mention of doing so in the future? Well, I wouldn't draw a parallel between Germany and Japan for several reasons. Germany was guilty of killing, of mass killing of people, not only in war, but a concerted effort to wipe out a whole community. Japan, although its behavior was awful from what I understand, particularly in the countries which it occupied during the war, particularly in the Philippines and Korea, where they left very bad memories of their occupation. It was an army, number one, it was an army occupation and not a planned extermination of civilian population. And number two, let's not forget also that Japan can claim the fact that it was at the receiving end of two nuclear bombs in 1945. So I guess the punishment for those years of war has been particularly strong against their civilian population. They did not acknowledge, you're right, they did not acknowledge, or they did acknowledge the crimes during the war, but they did not apologize. And this is a big bone of contention, if you will, between Korea, South Korea, North Korea is different, between Korea, South Korea today and Japan. The fact that despite—
And China as well.
And
as for not killing civilians, the Chinese might disagree with you to some degree there. Between 12 and 15 million Chinese were killed during that war. And there was grotesque. I mean, I know that what Germany did was worse, certainly, but Japan presents itself almost as if they were a victim during the course of the war. And their actions in Manchukuo in Korea, their experiments that they did on people made the stuff that Mengele was doing look almost timid by comparison. I mean, they really were absolutely off the charts in many ways. And they simply will not, they refuse to acknowledge that. And that has been, as you point out, a bone of contention between them, China, Vietnam as well. They instituted proceedings which caused a famine in Vietnam that killed over 1 million people. The Vietnamese thought they were in bad shape under the French until the Japanese showed up to supposedly, bring them freedom and justice under an Asian ruler. And they were treated far worse under them. But they've never really, I know that they were hit with the bombs afterwards, but that doesn't give them a clean slate in terms of what they did.
No, it doesn't. And you're right, China, well, the Japanese did not occupy the whole of China, they occupied Manchuria. And you're right, there were a number they wiped out a number of Chinese over there. There was never much love lost between Japan and China. And there was some resistance, Chinese resistance also to the Japanese occupation. So it can be argued that the Japanese army was fighting, if you will, in Manchuria against the Chinese, which does not excuse the crimes they committed there. But there was no, again, there was no deliberate will to wipe out an entire community like Germany in the name of race. Japan always considered itself traditionally a superior, the superior race in Asia, as the Aryans of Asia, and still do today. They admit very few foreigners to Japan, even though they would need the labor, and even more they needed it when in the 80s and 90s, when Japan was doing so well, was booming economically. But they accepted very few foreigners to their country because they believe that the Japanese race, if you will, it's the Aryan race of Asia. And even the foreigners who were let in did not really assimilate because they just could not assimilate into the Japanese society. But you're right, they committed war crimes.
And they had, like you pointed out, they had a tremendous sense of their own racial superiority. And it bled over even, not only over Asians, but over, they thought that the United States and Great Britain were so weak that they didn't even take steps to have anti-submarine warfare training for their people because they thought that the Americans and the British were too weak to and soft to maintain submarines, which of course during the course of the war they came to realize their folly in terms of that. but they regarded basically everyone else as being second class. They thought it was them, the Germans, and everyone else was, third and fourth level.
Indeed.
Okay, Pierre.
Yes.
This is Sherry. Yeah,
Yes.
I just want to point out that there were, can you hear me okay?
Yes. It's
okay.
much better now, Sherry. It's much
okay.
better.
Okay, there were war crime trials in Japan after the war, and there were people who were convicted and executed, leaders who were convicted and executed. It wasn't, an enormous number of people. It was, but it's not like there was, it was not ignored that there were war crimes committed by Japan.
No, but Tom is right in that Japan never really apologized.
No, they did not.
They never officially apologized. They did acknowledge the war crimes committed by their army in all those countries, in the countries they occupied. But they never officially, no Japanese government, whether right or left, has ever apologized for what it did during the war. And that is very important in that part of the world. Mm-hmm. Culturally also. From Mark. Gay rights and women's rights are positive examples how societies can change their public and private views through legislation and exposure and experience. Hopefully, the arc of moral justice is long but bends toward justice. Yes, the recognition of gay rights and women's rights are a positive example. Can they translate to racism and anti-Semitism? That can be the subject of another discussion. I don't know. I don't want to sound too skeptical, but I don't know. Again, unlike racism, gay rights and women's rights can be legiferated. You can have laws for gay rights and women's rights. And I don't believe that everybody approved those laws. Let's be honest, Mark. I think there are a number of people. I don't know if it's a minority of a number of people who do not approve, not necessarily of the rights, but do not approve of gay unions in general, or of women's rights in general. But you can vote laws which, like in the case of discrimination, can put an end to the discrimination between gay and between homosexuals and heterosexuals and women and men. Those laws, do they totally eradicate the issue? That's the subject of other discussion. I personally am skeptical. I don't really believe so. But your example is a good one. It shows that things can be done. But these are easier issues in a way than I believe, and less deeply rooted than the issues that we discussed earlier. From Alan, the legal restraints on free speech vary from country to country. Well, Alan, there are countries which have no free speech at all, most of them. out of the 193 countries, member states of the United Nations, you might have 40, 50, which have what you call, or what I would call, or what you would call free speech. There are countries which don't even, or whose citizens don't even dream of free speech. They never had any. Expressing views about, oh yeah, the legal restraints on free speech vary from country to country, expressing views about Holocaust. But given the globalization of communication, this is a serious dilemma worthy of perhaps a full session. Be more specific, what is the dilemma? Given the globalization of communication, this is a serious dilemma worthy of perception. You mean all the countries, we should discuss what the free speech is in terms of when it comes to expressing views about Holocaust? I don't understand what is...
Well, the limitations on free speech and to what extent that exists in certain countries. And of course, in the United States, the attitude is much more liberal in terms of what is permitted in terms of speech. Europe, for example, Western Europe has limitations. Most countries have limitations on what you can say about the denial of the Holocaust, things of that nature. And there are other areas, and we're talking about here what you can say and what you can do in terms of legislating. I'm talking about government rather than change practices on the street level. And that's something that is a discussion that goes on continuously.
If you're referring, I don't know if you're referring to the Holocaust per se, or if you're referring in general to free speech from country to country.
I just use that. I use that as an example, but there are lawsuits that go on, and it has been criminalized, I believe, to deny the Holocaust in Western Europe, some Western European countries, are certainly the basis of litigation. And we would, although we may in the United States condemn that sort of discussion, it is not legislated that you can talk about the denial of Holocaust. That's just an example. So we're talking also about, we were talking about the cartoons that were published in Denmark, whether you could actually outlaw that, or would you outlaw it? In Denmark, obviously, they won't do anything like that. On the other hand, certainly in Arab countries, to get away from Europe, they're the subjects of fatwas if you do something like that, and people get killed for it, just as they did in Denmark. And how you deal with this, and how society deals with it in terms of legislation and just social policies in terms of condemning this.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll think about it, because this goes a little bit beyond the framework of our topic, generally speaking, and it goes into a more of a philosophical conversation than really political conversation, and it involves a number of markers in different countries. Now, let me think about it by how we can apprehend this issue, and how we can, again, it goes back to what I was saying, the freedom of speech. and if there are really any limits to the freedom of speech. That being said, I don't know if we can, if I can have a presentation on the freedom of speech. What is freedom of speech? I can take the definition that the UN Charter of Human Rights gives of the freedom of speech. Other countries have their own definition of freedom of speech. I don't know if I can have a presentation that englobes everything.
The difficult topic.
Alan, this is more
discussion group.
This would be more a subject of a really discussion between all of us, because it will be interesting to have everybody's opinion on what freedom of speech is, rather than me guiding sort of. Again, the only thing I can say about freedom of speech is the one which is universally recognized by most countries, the UN definition, and then every country applies it differently. It's like, like freedom fighters. For one country, they are terrorists. For different countries, they fight for freedom. At the same thing for freedom of speech. And the terms of what is freedom. So then we're getting into a more of a philosophical conversation. But let's think about it when the elections are over and Armenia and Azerbaijan make nice and they stop fighting, and other issues of importance are resolved. We have a session when we can discuss this issue. Okay. Lawrence, I don't believe the laws passed against gay discrimination, change values, but we passed as a result to a change in values that was already continued evolving. Well, if you're trying to say that the laws were interpreting or expressing, rather, the majority of the public opinion, it could very well be that there was a change in values in the public opinion when it comes to gay discrimination, the anti-discrimination laws. Or is it because a government was more open or more inclined to pass such laws than the opposition? That is something that, but probably you're right to some extent. The laws were expressing an evolution in the society on these issues. Now, my question to you is that even though these laws were passed, do you think that they reflect the opinion of most people, or they reflect the opinion of a vocal minority which happens to be in power at a certain time and takes advantage of that situation for adopting laws that it believes just? and fair? That is my question. From Tom, the USA used to be a guiding light and a stable, rational example for the rest of the world. The torchlight processions of Charlottesville with fascists chanting "the Jews will not replace us" look like something straight out of the Nuremberg rallies in the 30s, in 1936, after which our president lauds those cretins as real good people. Our influence, for good or ill, matters around the globe. Where we lead, the world often follows. Where we lead, the world often follows. I agree with you that the US influence matters around the world. To what extent, I don't know. For good or ill, I don't know, because what you might consider as good as an American, a European, or another citizen of another country might not consider so great for his own country. As for the first part of your sentence, I respect your opinion. I understand what you say. I won't discuss it. But yes, the US opinion, considering its leading place in the world, matters. From Laurie, New Jersey has one of the strongest state laws against discrimination, the LAD. But successful prosecutions alone, and there have been many, don't seem to be enough to change the public's attitudes. And many racial discrimination cases are settled before court, so there is no publicity. Laurie, you're basically saying exactly the same thing as I did. I didn't know that the New Jersey has one of the strongest laws in the country on discrimination. But obviously it's not, adopting a law is not enough. The way that law is applied is what is important. And it shows a willingness of the authorities, of government, of people in power to implement them efficiently or not. And from what you're saying in your mail, which I did not know either, is that many of these cases are settled out of court. So there is no publicity. So there must be some compromise, I guess, when it's settled out of court, which is not, doesn't always plead in the name of discrimination. Yeah, I basically agree with you. If that's the case, that is basically what I was saying, is that it's one thing to pass a law, and it's a totally different thing to implement that law and to make it work. And in many of these cases, the implementation is just not there for a number of reasons. I'm not going to go into right now. So I guess we are done for today. There are no more questions, and we went from Germany and the neo-Nazis to the
Japan.
Oh, there is one more question, not question, comment from Lawrence. Public opinion has shown that more people are supportive of gay rights today than they were years ago, long before gay rights legislation was passed. My contention is that the laws were passed after public opinion evolved, rather than the laws changed public opinion. that also could be open to discussion. Generally speaking, a law is the expression of a majority of people. So the legislature adopts something based on what the constituents believe, or a majority of constituents believe. Now, is it always the public opinion before the law, or the law which is in a way revolutionary and that can shape the public opinion after that? It's the story of the chicken and the egg. That also we can be subject to discussion. I don't have an answer for that. I don't, but that's what you believe. And I understand your contention is that the laws reflect the opinion, majority of the public opinion, rather than the other way around. I don't know. I really don't know. There are sometimes laws which are adopted that the public opinion first is reluctant to implement, or is opposed to, but slowly is growing into accepting them. That being said, again, I don't know. But anyway, we came from Germany and neo-Nazis to New Jersey. New Jersey's law on gay rights. So we came a long way. And Alan writes to me, laws requiring integration has had great influence on racial attitude. These laws take time to show effect. You see, this is an example also, Lawrence, where laws requiring integration had influence on racial attitude. So it had influenced the opinion. So sometimes it's the laws which are influencing the opinion. Sometimes it's the opinion influencing the laws. But again, as I said earlier, in my opinion, it's not so much adopting a law which is difficult, because sometimes it's a trendy thing to do. It's what do you do is it once the law is adopted. This is the hardest part. Anyway, I feel like we've been very philosophical today, somehow. Maybe it's the weather. I wish you a great week, and I hope you're all well and safe. And I will see you all next Monday. And this time, I promise you, I know you can hardly wait for Armenia and Azerbaijan to be the subject of our discussion. So have a nice week, all, and see you all on Monday.